Carrie was going to do an introduction, and she did, but I don't think the audio came through. I know I didn't hear anything. I'll do a quick introduction. So welcome to the Minnesota Change Management Network. For those who haven't used Zoom before, we're on an honor system, so you can unmute yourselves, but if 94 people unmute themselves and talk at the same time, it would be a pretty fun experiment. So we'll get to the questions at the end of the session. So you can see on the screen that there is a link to a tool called Slido, sli.do. And that is where, as we're going through the material today, you can ask questions there and you can actually vote on them as well. So what I plan to do is, this is like a technique called lean coffee that I use pretty much in any type of change situation. And it basically puts the people who are impacted by the change in control of what we're going to talk about. So I'll get into moving away from push-based communication and more around dialogue. And this is a really great tool that I've used in live settings, at all company meetings, on webinars and things like that. So if you add your question to the Slido, if there's one there that you like, you can vote for it. And after we go through the webinar, then I will answer the highest voted questions. So for those typing the ones into the chat, we'll get to those as well. If you want to retype them in Slido just to get some people to vote, you'll see it actually update on the screen in real time as well. All right, so let's get started. So a little bit about me, former developer. So if anyone remembers, if anyone on the call is a developer who remembers the language Cold Fusion, you might recognize the syntax up there. I've always tossed this little joke out that I'm the world's greatest Cold Fusion developer, but I was probably the world's only Cold Fusion developer. So some people might recognize a little bit of that gibberish up at the top. So Twitter web addresses are there. I started building applications in the mid 90s. And if anyone remembers the Harlequin romance novels, I wrote their newsletter engine before things like MailChimp and a lot of these SaaS-based free newsletter things were kind of out there in the world. Through there, I got involved in project management. I've worked as a product owner on a team. I've worked as a tester, an agile coach, internal, external, worked for multiple startups, and got started with agile, I guess, in the early 2000s. So some of the startups I was working for, I think a lot of startups naturally work that way without knowing what it is. And that was the case for me and the team I was working on. So we used a lot of the practices that are in some of the agile processes today, just without knowing. So we did daily stand-ups because we were building the software and supporting it. We did weekly retrospectives, which was just going out for beers on Friday to see how things were going and what could we change. And most importantly, we limited our work in progress, which is one of the cornerstones of Kanban, which is one of the agile processes, depending on if you want to look at it that way. And evolved from there. And then the mid 2000s, I started working with companies to help them move towards agile ways of working. So that would be in large enterprise telecoms, banks, small media companies, healthcare, pretty much everything in between. And what got me involved in change was just over 10 years ago, working in a large telecom. I was working as an agile coach, and I was filling in as a scrum master on multiple different business teams, training teams, and IT teams all over the place. And in this one particular project, the PMO director and the senior manager brought me into their office and said, yeah, we want to run this as an agile project, but we don't want agile to get in the way. And back then, the only answer I had, well, there's only 4 values in agile. Which ones of those do you want me to not follow? Then I realized what they were actually saying was there's this whole big organization that people in agile circles really aren't addressing. They're talking about how everything is about the team. Team needs to be self-organized. The team can handle this. The team needs to be directly, in front of the customer, et cetera, et cetera. But there wasn't a lot of information around, well, how does this affect these massive transformations in these organizations where a software team might have 20 different stakeholder groups to work with? We're starting to see that with a lot of scaling frameworks and stuff today. But that was my trigger to make me aware of, oh, there's some other stuff that we as a team need to consider. So all of the ideas I'm going to go through today really started, actually, it's just past the 10th anniversary of a blog post that I wrote. I remember sitting in that client's office thinking, oh man, like this just isn't working. There's got to be a better way to do this. What if we actually started looking at applying these agile techniques to change? Like, why would we try to plan out a 5-year transformation, get all the tasks done, get everything all kind of sorted out, and then start? That just doesn't work. So that's kind of what started everything. And today, the plan is to go through a little short exercise. So if you haven't used Zoom before, there's a really neat little feature in here that will automatically put you guys into little small breakout rooms. I'm going to give you a little scenario to chat about for 5 minutes, and we're going to come back and look at an option that you guys have created for that scenario. So instead of just telling you what this stuff is, we're going to do just a quick simulation and see if we can figure out together what this lean change management stuff is all about. So here's the scenario. So you're working with an internal team, an internal change team on a large change program. You're installing a new enterprise piece of software. It's not going very well. People are pretty frustrated across the board because there really hasn't been a lot of visible progress. There's only 12 months left before the old system is shut off, so it's got to get done. And with 6 months of no progress, people are pretty stressed out. So your main stakeholders have come to you pretty frustrated and said they want you, the change person or change team, to come in on Monday with a detailed plan for the next 12 months to ensure successful ROI, on time, on budget completion. What could you do about this problem? So I'm going to hit the magic button that's going to break you into some breakout groups. I'll set a timer for 5 minutes. The rules are pretty simple. I mean, this is a fairly universal problem. I'm sure many people have seen similar things before. In those breakout groups, I'll give you 5 minutes to consider the scenario, and as a group, come up with one thing that you could do, one option per breakout group. The tricky part, this is much easier to do in person, so let's see how it works on the Zoom here, but designate one person to type in what you would do into the chat, and then I'm going to use those options when everyone comes back to the main room. So again, just a quick little review about the scenario. You're installing a large software system. There hasn't been any progress. People are frustrated, and you're being asked to give the next 12-month detailed plan that will ensure successful execution of this change. So let's see how this goes. This will put you into breakout rooms automatically, and in 5 minutes, I'll invite you back to the main window.
And I don't know if you automatically get muted.
Oh, okay.
Nope, everybody has full control over it. I can do a mute all, but it's always a fun social experiment because you often find, there's some people yelling at their kids in the background or a dog barking, and gets everybody a little chuckle.
Oh, Jason, this is Anne Marie. I put ours out in the chat.
Okay, cool. Yeah. All right, so everybody should be back in the main room now. Always interesting to see how this experiment works with this many people. I've done this with about 50 or 60 people before, not with 100-ish. So hopefully, I think there was one group that had a problem with audio, but hopefully it worked for most folks. So what we've done is we've just collected some insights. And obviously this is not a long period of time to go through this, but this is, how do we know as change people what it is that we're supposed to do and what we're supposed to work on? There's tons, Google change management method, you'll find millions of them out there. Some of them are similar, some of them are opposite, some are kind of, exactly the same, just with different language. But how is it that we know what to do as change people? I could try something in one environment that would work great, and I could try something in another similar environment and it wouldn't work at all. So collecting insights is, what do we know about this problem? What do we think we know? What assumptions do we have? Can't read the slides. So these, what I have here in these little blue blocks, you should be able to full screen it as well. These are the options that are in the chat. So I just typed in like the first sentence from each one of them. I will export the details of the chat afterwards as well. But don't worry too much about what is actually on these virtual sticky notes. This is more the idea of how to do it. So we have some options that we could do. At this point, we're not ready to commit to a course of action just yet. We want to figure out what options could we do that are going to get us one step closer to our objective. And this is one way that we can quickly go through and start to classify some of these options. So for example, if I took the Big Bang Comms Plan training one. So in my context, let's just say, you know, it's an enterprise organization. There's 5,000 people that are part of this program. This option would possibly come at a high cost. So it's going to be kind of up here on the slider just because of the sheer scale of it. So if we looked at this option and we believe it's going to be high cost, now how valuable would it be for us to do this? We might say, yeah, we think it would be pretty valuable. So let's put this one out over here. Then there was one that was kind of opposite. It was, don't go into that much detail, do just come up with some major short-term things that we could do right now to get some progress. So that might be related to this, this larger one. It might be a lot less costly to do this option. And then it might be, let's just say maybe it's slightly more valuable. So we'll move it over there. This is an idea taken from relative estimating from software development teams. So what software teams will do is they will take a specific feature that everyone understands really well. They'll use that as an anchor, and they will relatively size features against it. So humans just suck at estimating. Doesn't matter what it is. We're not good at it. But we're really good at saying, you know what, this thing is about the same as that one, or this thing is a lot bigger, this thing is a lot smaller, etc. So going through this cost value exercise is a way for us not to get to an action right away, but consider a bunch of options, even crazy ones, because each of these will have different attributes depending on if we believe it's high cost, low value, or high value. It's kind of like a filtering process. So for example, something that might be low cost and low value, it might not seem like it's worthwhile to do right now, but it might be a good example of a quick win that has some impact. It might not have high impact, but it might be something that shows us some visible progress. So the idea is not to worry about a best practice, because those don't exist in the change world. It's more about how do we consider our context, consider what options we have, and make a more well-informed choice about how we move forward. So we might choose to say, you know what, we need to pick this low value or this low cost, high value option down here, the major milestones. And we might need to consider part of the diagnostics, which we think is going to be a high cost, but maybe not as valuable. So we're just going to decide, you know what, for right now, let's pick these two. These are the two things that we believe are going to be the most important in this scenario to move us forward. And from there, we populate those things on our Kanban board. So here's the options that we have now turned into experiments. With our experiments, we have a hypothesis of what we want to do. We have an idea about how do we know if this is going to be successful or not. So we separate our measurements from our diagnostics and we visualize our work. With Kanban, Kanban is a pull-based process. So I've seen some people refer to Kanban and show a Gantt chart. It's kind of a backwards Gantt chart, if you will. So people who are brand new to Kanban, it's value-based, not push and time-based. So for example, we have the green ones here are in prepare. So every change needs some type of planning, but at different levels. The idea with prepare is we're actually doing it with the people affected by the change. We're not doing it in isolation as change people. We're doing it with people, and we're helping them figure out the right options forward. Our work in progress is what changes do we have in progress right now. The stars would represent things that have dependencies between them. Once we've finished the experiment, we move it to review and then to done. So now, depending on how far of a time horizon we need to plan for, the simplest thing is, here's the big things that are next. It's not worth it to go into detail, very minutia detail around these things we're going to do next, because once we've finished some of these experiments that are in progress, we might not need them anymore. So let's put our energy into breaking experiments down into small things we can do right now. One way to think about it is, start all of your change projects red. If you start out a project, you have a pocket full of money and an empty head. So how can it possibly be green? So if we start our projects red and we think about what are the 3 smallest things we can do next week to move closer to green. So it's opposite from how we would normally approach these types of things. The further we're looking away, next month or next quarter, the size of those squares mean they're just big ideas. We wouldn't really want to go into details about stuff 6 months from now or a year from now. We want to focus our time and energy on things that are going to move the needle right now in our context. One of the cornerstones of Kanban as well, you can see that there's IT stuff, training and business readiness, and those are called swim lanes. So that's basically how you can group different types of work together, so you can see the whole picture of what's really happening. So I get a lot of questions around, how do we integrate change management with an Agile team? Add a swim lane to their Kanban board and go to their stand-ups. That's it. You don't need a big framework. You don't need to completely throw out your existing processes. Simple, small experiments over time to more tightly integrate the team. The objection I usually get to that is, it's too simple, it couldn't possibly work. And the second one, we're not allowed to do that in our environment because we can't go and talk to other departments without going up the chain of hierarchy. So there are some cultural or other types of roadblocks that could prevent it. The idea with quote unquote lean change management is as simple as possible, because as soon as we start focusing on process, we start to lose sight sometimes of the purpose behind the change, or the vision that we're trying to achieve. So keep it as simple as possible. I'll show a couple of stories and examples first. I'll just go into a little bit more details about that little simple scenario that we went through. So we started with some insights. I gave you a scenario. There were some facts that we knew. We knew that we were 6 months into this project. We knew there were 12 months until the old system got shut off. We knew people were frustrated. Now, what assumptions could we make about that? Well, we could make assumptions that we're not aligned. For example, we have different groups that have different performance management. So we might be incentivizing one group to go down this road, and we're incentivizing another group to go down a different road, but we need to get them to work together. So we could start to ask ourselves, if we wanted to suggest some options for solving this, what is it that we actually need to know? What are the questions we need answers to in order to move forward? Then we moved into options. So that was where I put the cost value chart up. So now, given that we have some things that we could do, let's filter them, let's sort them, let's understand our context, because every change is different, and even the same change in different contexts gives you a different scenario to work within. So we don't want to commit to an action. We want to have options that can help guide our decision-making process. Then we move to our experiments. Now, given we've considered our insights, given we've created some options that we could do, which ones are most likely to move us forward? And how would we know? So what's our hypothesis? We think that if we did, specifically in the scenario, if we are already 6 months into this, odds are we already had a big plan in the first place. So if we created another big plan, how would it be different? That might be the right thing to do. It might not be the right thing to do. If you want to look at the, the core idea behind this, it's double loop learning. So how do we question what we did in the first place that got us into this scenario? What should we try differently next time? So diagnostics. What would be a diagnostic that would tell us we're headed in the right direction instead of just thinking about after the fact measurements? And then we get into the tactical execution with agile practices. So I've worked with some change teams that work with weekly sprints, monthly sprints, bi-weekly sprints. Some of them just use Kanban, which is a flow-based process instead of an iterative time-based process. And that will depend on type of change, the organization, what access do you have with stakeholders. But the concept is all rooted in agile design thinking and lean startup. Empathy for the customer. What is it that we need to know to move forward? How do we know we got there? How short should our feedback loops be? So, you know, some people, they'll see the word lean and they'll jump to Lean Six Sigma. They might jump to lean manufacturing. They might jump to lean software development. In this context, for me, it's always been about what is the simplest possible lightweight approach we can take for change that will help us move things forward one small step. I think we put too much stock sometimes in having a well-crafted vision statement, but for anyone who has one, if you went and asked people in your organization, more often than not, they wouldn't know what it was. But they would still have a general idea that if we're digitally transforming or going through an agile transformation, generally we're aligned because we can paint a picture in our head that, oh, it means we're going to go kind of that way. But we might not be able to put that in words very well. But we have a general idea. So now, great. What are we going to do over the next month to get us closer? Then what are we going to do next quarter? So you can look at a couple of things, one being a 12-week year, and the other being mastering the Rockefeller habits. So I worked with an organization where we were using mastering the Rockefeller habits, and it's a way for you to break down, it's basically what business agility was before people started talking about business agility. So it's a very old concept. It's probably 20-ish years old. And you start with your 20-year big, hairy, audacious goal. You break it down into 3 to 5 year goals, annual goals, quarterly goals, monthly, and then weekly. So in this organization, our leadership team, we would meet once a week and we would say, you know, here's the one most important thing I'm working on in my group next week in the context of what we're trying to do as an organization. And then every month we did more detailed retrospectives on, okay, now that we've done these things for the month, has that got us closer to where we want to be? And what can we do next? And this is exactly what agile software teams will do. They'll take a big objective, they'll break it down into small pieces, they'll work in time box chunks or in Kanban in a flow-based type of process and show progress consistently. That gives us enough information to properly de-risk things and move things forward over time. And the bigger our process is, the less we're likely to think about it, and the more likely we're going to focus on process and governance and maybe sometimes forget about the change part. Here's a quick story from an organization. This is a large global pharmaceutical organization that was going under a transformation, and came in for a couple of days. We did a workshop and then did some sessions around, well, our transformation is kind of stuck. What can we do? So we had a cross-functional group of people in the room, and the middle picture is what's called a circles and soup diagram. And this is a practice that agile teams would do in their retrospectives. And it's basically, when we want to improve something, what can we control? What can we influence? What's outside of our influence? So there were 4 groups breaking down things that they could do, and they would put their sticky notes where their influence was. Then each group would rotate to the next group. And the cool thing that happened is, you know, somebody who had influence in an area, they would look at a sticky that was on the far outer circle and say, oh, you know what? Well, I know Bob in accounting, so I'll write my name on this, put that in direct. That's an experiment I can do. So in a half a day, we went through that exercise, and then on the right is the Kanban board. So now what are we going to do over the next month? We didn't have to redo the entire plan. We didn't have to change a whole pile of stuff about what they've already done because they'd been undergoing this transformation, you know, for a good year already. It was basically a little spot where they were stuck and they needed a little jiggle to get free of that stuckness and move forward. So the entire group voted. You can probably see a little bit of the dots on the stickies up there. So they voted on what we could do, and then the things that had the highest votes were the things that got worked on. So you can see in prepare, there were the 4 highest voted stickies here, and that's what they worked on for a month. And then after a month, let's review it and see what happened. Are the experiments that we plan to do next, are they still valid? Should we throw them away? Should we pursue them? But let's not get too locked into thinking about everything, because we know things are going to change quite often. So the pattern of using agile practices is really getting into a rhythm of doing these types of things. Whatever change method or framework you're using, you can still use these exact same techniques. They're sense-making tools. They help us make sense of complex organizations. And especially in today's world where things change so quickly, if we get into this rhythm of every month or whatever cadence makes sense, we start to learn ourselves towards what are the right things to do over time. A second one, this was in a government organization undergoing a 3-year modernization program. And the context was the person reached out to me and said, if we do this the way we normally do these things, we're going to wake up in 3 years, none of the software is going to work, and everybody's going to be pretty angry about that. So we started with creating personas. Who's affected by this and how? And is there kind of a pattern across the organization? Because ultimately 8,000 people were affected by this change. We had 14 personas. In the picture on the bottom left, see if the zooming thing works up. Across the top are the divisions and departments. Down the left-hand side are the things that will change, and the colors in the middle represent who's affected by what. So that helped the team realize where to focus their energy early on. And I think the ultimate flattery was the email that he sent me a month later, or sorry, a year later. A month would be nice for something like this, but about a year later. This was the only experiment. Visualized the work and brought stakeholders in front of it for 15 minutes once a week. And the amount of problems they found just by having a really, really short session once a week to de-risk this project, plus to show the stakeholders that for some of these large programs, you know, these massive software installs, you might not see anything for 6 to 8 months. But getting these folks in front of it, they were like, wow, this is actually a lot more work than we thought. So they solved a lot of problems very quickly by getting people together. Visualizing work is kind of the bare minimum. If you're not visualizing the change work, none of the other practices are really long-term, because this is, think of it like air traffic control is how I like to think of these information radiators. It allows us to, at a high level, see how all the parts are interconnected, and we can act as orchestrators, and we can act as coordinators, versus trying to figure out how to do all of it up front and push it out. The different colors of the sticky notes meant something. There's a legend up at the top. I don't remember exactly what, but it gave them a frame to work within. And this was what was called the single source of truth. So if you want to know what's going on with this program at a high level, this is the single source of truth. It didn't replace any project tracking system at all, or time tracking system. It was one layer above that as an orchestration tool. So it is extra work, I'm not going to lie about that, but the value, because you can't replicate this in a tool. There are tools that do it, but like every tool, from my experience, they just become stale. The idea with this is to have people collaborating in front of it and having conversations instead of through whatever software it is that we're using. The last story I'll share is in an organization, a large financial organization, where this was the second year of the transformation. These guys were a bit of an odd duck because they considered their transformation a generational change, which was unheard of from any large organization I've been in. They knew this wasn't a year-long program or even a 5-year program. This was fundamentally a deep change, because they subscribed to an idea called Theory U from Otto Sharma, which is, we can't kind of continually improve our way from A to B. We have to strip away why we exist as an organization, get right down to purpose, and rebuild things from the ground up. So we did what was called an annual summit every year, and we would get 200 or so people in a room. We would talk about the 3 main challenges to solve over the next 6 months or a year, depending on the time horizon. And on the screen are basically the 17 different teams from those 200 people, each created a change canvas and came up with 3 actions that they were going to do over the next month. And then 2 of the executives walked around the conference center and they actually signed their names on it. So it might be, you know, the VP of HR would sponsor an IT thing, an IT change. The idea was they just needed somebody at a high level in the organization who had influence and authority to help them move these things forward. So the way this technique worked was the people went away, they created their change canvases, they went up on stage and they did a recorded 60-second talk about the problem and what they were going to do about it. And we got back together 6 months later and reviewed them to see what actually happened, closed the chapter, and then opened up the next chapter on the next set of things. So a lot of it is really about rhythm. How do we get into a rhythm and a groove and move our, you know, stop using change manager language and use change facilitator language is one of the things I like to talk about a lot. So how do we facilitate this and make it clear that we're a support function, not a controlling function? So I talked a little bit about insights. How do we know what it is that we're supposed to change? Where does that information come from? You know, we gather our insights from everywhere. Interviews, observing people, going to meetings, doing surveys. So this part of the lean change management process, if you want to call it that, is let's not get locked into our assumptions about what's a best practice, because they just don't exist from my experience. There's good practices that can help us, but if we could repeat the same process as a best practice, then every change should work. And it just doesn't work that way. So we need to understand more about our context. What's the pace of change? What type of change is it? If we're moving printers, nothing I'm talking about here makes any sense. Make a list of printers and move them and create a plan. You don't need an agile type of process to do that kind of change. It's actually probably worse if you did it that way. So know your context as you're gathering your insights before you turn them into options. This is where all of our trade-offs happen. We also don't like to talk a lot about what it is that we're not changing. So, especially in agile contexts, if we're transforming to agile, we're not going to, you know, change our performance management. We know that's going to get in the way at some point, but we're not prepared to do that yet. So we can have a more well-informed discussion about what trade-offs we're going to make and the consequences of those trade-offs as well, and then get into execution. What's our hypothesis? How are we going to know? Let's visualize it and see what happens. A big part of experiments is wiping the slate clean. So let's not worry about an experiment that didn't work. Let's just learn from it. I've never been a fan of the you have to fail to learn language, or how lean startup has made, you know, the failure word kind of really hot and sexy nowadays. I'm more of a fan of you're going to learn from experience. If you get locked into it's okay to fail and some of the stuff that you see coming out of the, you know, agile design thinking lean startup community, I'm just not a fan of that. I'm more of a fan of here's what we thought when we tried it, because it brings us back to intent. What was the intent of doing this? The intent was to do this. Just the tactic wasn't the right one. Okay, cool. So did our intent change? No, we still want to move towards ABC. Awesome. What would be a better experiment? Wipe the slate clean, move forward. So over the last 6 years or so, collecting change challenges from all over the world, running so many workshops, you know, the interesting thing about lean change management is where change agents are coming from. So there'll be lots of people coming from HR, from agile coaching, from traditional change management, project management, and just team management scenarios. And I always collect the change challenge. So what's the most important thing, like the question I asked you guys at the top, what's the most important thing you want to learn about this? And it really didn't matter the country, the size of the company, the industry, the discipline where the person was coming from. The challenges were all the same. And all of these change challenges, thousands of them, distilled into 5 specific areas to focus on. I don't want to call them principles because I don't believe people have principles. Methods, frameworks, tools, models don't have principles. They're a reflection of the personality of the creator, or they're created to sell something, basically, is kind of my belief. So I don't want to call them principles, but these were areas that people seemed to say that when they focused on, for example, meaningful dialogue over communication plans, which just usually becomes broadcasting, they're more likely to figure out what the right thing to do is. The green one at the top, when we focus more on the cause and the purpose for this as opposed to urgency, because urgency is usually one-sided from the perspective of the organization, not necessarily from the people doing the work. So when we focus on giving these 5 dimensions the right attention by using co-creative types of practices and agile and lean practices, we're more likely to move things forward. So cause and purpose, I talked a little bit. You know, if the urgency for the change is to raise revenue by 10%, does that help a developer on a team? Is that motivating for them? Probably not. But if the purpose is switched towards, you know, if we're in healthcare, our goal is 0 patient deaths. That's a purpose we can rally around. So how do we move away from just talking about urgency? Partially because the feeling that just seems to stress people out when we talk about urgency. And sometimes we artificially create urgency that doesn't seem to have a real effect on people. But if we move towards cause and purpose, how does that shape our change differently? How does that move us towards where it is that we actually want to go? Like I mentioned, meaningful dialogue. So often change communications, from my experience, ends up being more like broadcasting. So for example, let's use lean coffee sessions instead of newsletters. I've done executive sponsored lean coffees. I've used this tool like Slido in public all company meetings where the leaders are up on stage in a public session. Slido is up on the projector behind them, and it's anonymous. People are asking questions in real time. So you're more likely to get what people are really thinking about instead of what I've seen so many times. The comms people are writing the questions because they want people to hear the leaders answer those questions. So it's a pretty significant shift, but it is a risky one. The organization where I showed the canvases earlier, the 17 teams that created their canvases, somebody asked the question to the CTO, we keep hearing how we need to change things. What are you prepared to change? And nobody's going to ask that question publicly when they're handed a microphone or if they are forced to put their name on it. So it popped up anonymous, and surprise, it was voted #1 like right away. And he answered it. He answered it very well. He said, well, my problem is my level of competitiveness and push. And sometimes I need to learn to be more patient and let things unfold the way they're going to unfold. So lean coffee and using this type of technology like Slido are ways to move us towards dialogue that makes sense and actually matters, instead of just getting locked into broadcasting information. Doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means we're going to get better insights if we have meaningful dialogue than if we just push things out one way. Resistance to change has always been my favorite topic, because for me, it's kind of like saying, I did my work and it's all y'all's fault because you resisted. All we can do is control our reaction to how people respond to change. And if we have very strong active resistance, in traditional words, that's a great thing, because that gives us some great insights into maybe it's not the right change, maybe it's not the right time, maybe the approach isn't the right one. So it's data to collect. So I see it as input. If we have nothing and we have apathy, that's almost worse. So if we shift our thinking towards just looking at what that response is, that will help us figure out what options we can do to move forward, instead of starting from the negative, which is if we have to have a resistance mitigation program. Sometimes that goes into coercion at some point, or we start to use performance management and kind of old management carrot and stick methods to wrestle people into submission so they come along for the change. you know, maybe some environments that's the only way change is going to happen. But in my view, if we flip towards just looking at what that response is, that's very valuable data that will help us figure out how to move forward. This one's obvious, co-creation over getting buy-in. If you wanted to say in a lean change management process, you don't get buy-in, it means you are building the change with the people affected by it. So Jill Forbes, who I have an awesome case study on the website from her, she says, the people who write the plan don't fight the plan. So let's build it with them instead of building it and trying to sell it to them. And then finally, moving to experiments over just executing activities. This one's, again, fairly self-explanatory. How do we experiment our way through change instead of just checking the boxes from our process? So when we put all these things together, we end up with, here's a collection of practices that we could do. Let's pick the ones that make sense for our context. So instead of following, 10 things in a specific framework or method, let's look at design thinking. Let's look at liberating structures. Let's look at Lego Serious Play, which I've used a lot. Let's look at practices from Agile and Lean Startup and software development and bring that stuff into change, because software folks have been doing this stuff forever, and build our own contextualized approach to change. So the last thing is, yes, I'll describe Lego Serious Play in a second. So I just saw that question come in the chat. It's define balance. A lot of approaches to change fall into a right and wrong, best practice, do this, don't do that. I've used some co-creative practices in some environments and none of it worked. So the lesson for me was, oh, a different approach is needed here until I can get to a place of pull-based change. And I've worked in some environments where anything created ahead of time and push-based didn't work at all. So the whole idea is to balance this teeter-totter based on the environment you find yourself in and the culture that you're working within. So I'm going to get into some of the questions, and for Jean, yes, the slides will be up. They're actually up right there at slideshare.net/agilecoach. There's a whole bunch of free resources and case studies at those URLs as well. And the highest voted question was, what challenges have you faced with lean change management? How did you overcome them? I would say specific to that question, it's more often than not, the change agents who are not willing to step outside of what they already know to try something different. It's very rarely, if ever, something with people affected by the change, because they don't really care about this stuff. They just want help doing their work, or they want to be left alone to do their work. So it's more about, we bought method X for X millions of dollars and trained everybody. Sell us lean change management so we can convince our stakeholders so they'll let us use it. So getting into those kind of scenarios where there's already a big sunk cost in existing frameworks and tools, that's been a problem. And usually, to overcome it is just do it. Everybody has to do stakeholder management, but you don't need to do a 45-page detailed plan and for 6 months. You can get these folks in a room and do a change canvas. You can do a weekly stand-up for 15 minutes instead of your normal bi-weekly 2-hour transformation meeting. So small interventions over time that, for one, shows that you're there to support, and two, frees up people's time. So I've run into this a lot, trying to add more onto people's existing busy schedules already. So how to reuse things. So for example, every department has a monthly or weekly team meeting. Ask the managers, can I use the last 10 minutes of your existing meeting to spread some information about this change that's coming up? So it's always thinking in terms of customer empathy. Usually solve some of those challenges, but I would definitely say it's mostly change folks that say, well, that could never work here. We can't do that. Then great, don't do it. I would rather focus the energy on places that go, you know what, maybe that canvas wouldn't work, but maybe if I started with that and I changed this thing to that, that might work. That's pretty much how all of those obstacles go away when people start to see the possibilities. Particular industries where these principles have proved more challenging. I wouldn't say so much industries as just cultures, because I've seen some banks that have, you know, more collaborative cultures where it works well, and I've seen ones that are more the opposite and they just don't work at all, because usually the levers that are in place that get people to change are performance management based, which will always get in the way of any type of co-creation. You know, people are, I worked in one organization where nobody would even go to informal lean coffee sessions because their HR performance management, they would get credit for going to official training and official things at the company. So they would never go to something just because they had the opportunity to. Country maybe is the most differentiator. Like in the Nordics, everything works because they just have a whole different approach for how they approach change. Japan, facilitator I know there says some of these practices, it's hard because of the social hierarchy. So if you look at, what is it, Gearhart's has dimensions around power distance index. So when you look at cultures that have a very strong social hierarchy, co-creation type of stuff doesn't work very well, because thou shalt respect the hierarchy. So I would say usually the environments where it's been most challenging is when there isn't one strong catalyst who's an advocate and an influencer. So the government example that I showed with the big Kanban board, if that main program manager wasn't very influential and wanted to do this, none of that would have happened. So more often than not, it comes down to someone or a handful of people who are the first movers that want to use a different way to move things forward, I would say. Primary difference between change management and lean change management: pull-based versus push-based. Traditional change is more project management focused from my experience, and the approach that I like to take is completely pull-based. That's a very oversimplified answer. But I would say the focus is on servant leadership and being a change facilitator, not a change manager. Change management partner with project management, put sticky notes on a wall, get people in front of it, and watch the magic. And again, that's an oversimplified answer, but it's one that's worked very, very well for, you know, the last 18 years or so of my career, because it gets people together talking about stuff. One organization, we actually invited the PMO to see our enterprise Kanban board, and then they started doing it to manage their project portfolios. The key thing was we didn't try to change them. We said, hey, here's how we do things. If this makes sense to you, we'll help you with it. If it doesn't, then no harm, no foul. Again, customer empathy, servant type of approach. There's a bunch of other questions in the chat, and I know we're coming up to the end of the session. So what I'm going to do is, I always do this because there's always more questions than I can get through. I always capture the chat, and then I usually just do like a little short YouTube video with some answers as well. And then I can put that up somewhere as well. So as I'm talking, I'm just copying and pasting this. So Carrie, I don't know if you can jump back in if you wanted to say anything in closing.
Yeah.
Okay,
if you
awesome.
can hear me
Good.
this time,
Yes,
that
it's
would be
working.
awesome.
Groovy.
Thank you so much. Jason, thank you. This has been fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be sending out an email with a link to 6 quick questions. We'd like to get your responses to this event. Thank you so much for joining us. Jason, thank you for all of the great information and links, etc. You can all go to his website, of course, and meander around to find more. And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Cool. And if anybody wants to stick around, this is just on my open Zoom channel. So if anyone wants to stick around and chat a bit more, I'll just put myself on mute for a couple minutes so people can feel free to drop off. And then anyone who's still left, we can still chat about some of these questions if you want. So thanks for having me, Carrie and Melissa.
You bet. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right, so there's still, yep, still a few people around. Again, you control your own muting as well. So as we get less and less people, for people that are going to stick around, feel free to unmute and clarify a question or jump in with something as well. I'm just going to go kind of chronologically backwards through what's in the chat, and this is going to be recorded as well, so people won't miss the extra chat stuff. So. Couple here from Colin. Maturity levels that you've seen in teams and orgs as they start journeying towards this. We have several teams starting to explore, and curious if I've seen early adopters transition these into disciplined habits. I would say usually there is the first movers, the people who try this first, who provide social proof for others that are either positive or negative skeptics. So, there's cases where there's always going to be a handful of people that see something like this and go, you know what, I can really see how this will help. And they just go do it. They don't need support. They don't need training. They just kind of run off and go do this stuff. And then other people start to notice. And then they start to show these other people what it is that they're doing. I would say sometimes it works its way into, a playbook. Here's a set of practices that we've done that have worked, and then they kind of absorb it into their whatever existing change framework or process that they're using. Or in some companies that have dedicated change managers or that capability, it becomes the foundation of how they do things. So there's a global company I'm doing some work with now, and part of their process is start of any kind of change or improvement, we do a change canvas. So we get all of the people in the room, highest stakeholder on the business and IT sides, everybody who has to do something different on a day-to-day basis, and they're in the room together to do a change canvas. So we can start to align people around what we want to do, how we're going to do it, how it's going to be measured, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes these changes are being kind of dropped on them from higher up in the organization. So we've created this continuous improvement program, and every division has to have 3 continuous improvement things a week. Well, obviously you're going to get those because if people are being measured on that, that's what's going to happen. But they've kind of turned it into, well, in that constraint, the simplest thing we could do is align people around a canvas, create the experiments, and go, and then support them on a regular cadence. What else do we have here? We have, can you use this to create engagement and communication change plan? Yes, I didn't show it. I made reference to the case study that's up on the website. This organization, I mentioned Jill Forbes, the people who write the plan don't fight the plan. So there's a case study from National Leasing. So hopefully this picture comes through. This was their comms plan. So they put their canvases up in the main hallway. And this is one way to show people that change is happening. And the second thing is it got people collaborating in front of these things so they could actually chat about how things were working. So visualizations become communication tools, but they also enable meaningful dialogue. The key for me has always been more the meaningful dialogue stuff. So yes, it's important to communicate things out, but as long as that is not kind of evolved into broadcasting, we're more likely to get feedback about how this change is going so we can move it forward. Determining our current state, what progress has been made and what's been communicated, where people are on the ADKAR scale. I've used this with ADKAR before in one organization. So we didn't use the ADKAR method, we just used the ADKAR assessment. So we went through and had awareness and desire levels for multiple divisions split and sliced in a whole bunch of different ways to help try to focus our attention. But we didn't follow any of the other ProSci practices. Just the ADKAR assessment is a really good tool to use to gather insights. And then we can start to integrate that with weekly sprints, weekly change sprints, or bi-weekly change sprints. But it was an instrument for us to gather insights, was the way that we used it. So we didn't use it exactly the way ProSci teaches, but that mental model was a good thing for us to find out where we should focus our efforts. And I think the other ones up at the top were more related to the survey, or sorry, the little scenario, were answers from the scenario. So let me scroll back down and see if there was any other kind of follow-ups here. We have here, any tips on how to use the Kanban board for a stand-up format? Stand-ups, they're executed a little differently in Scrum and Kanban processes. So in a Scrum process, a daily stand-up is typically, here's what I worked on yesterday, here's what I'm working on today, here's the obstacles I have, and everybody will say something. In a Kanban stand-up, for example, it's focused on the actual work. So if I bring this picture back here, these 4 sticky notes that we're working on, we would just focus on the first one up at the top here, and we would say, what do we need to do to this thing to move it to the next step, to pull it across? What would be done with our plan so we can start to work on it? And maybe not everybody will talk at that session. That gets us focused on the work instead of the people, because I've seen lots of cases where if we get, if we follow the Scrum format, 5 minutes before the stand-up, people go, oh crap, the stand-up's coming, I better make something up so I look busy. And it gets you the opposite effect sometimes. So focus on just the work that needs to get done. And another picture I'll show here. This is from a multi-year enterprise transformation. This is their Kanban board. The big yellow sticky notes represent the strategic pillars. The orange sticky notes represent, they called them epics. So in the Scrum framework, there's user stories, which are features, and there are epics, which are just big features. So because they were moving towards agile ways of working, they were using agile language to describe how they were executing change. So the orange things were, epics, and the green things were change user stories. We had this duplicated in 3 locations because they don't move as often as features do. So again, this goes back to the communication tool. This was right where the VP would walk by every day. So it's a little reminder, if anybody's done any little reminder techniques about, put a sticky note on your door before you leave to remind you to take your keys or whatever it is, same kind of idea. Change work is often invisible. So if it's staring us right in the face through sticky notes, it's a reminder that we want to do things differently. And they change over time. So this team had tried to use a tool for a long time and it didn't work. And then they started to put these boards up. They don't use them anymore because they don't need them anymore. It was a temporary change that served its purpose. And then once the collaboration started, that's really the magic of these Kanban boards. It gets people together collaborating instead of just throwing emails back and forth. So when I would facilitate these ones, say for example, in this organization where we had all of our programs and projects on the wall, and we would get 30 to 40 people every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in front of this Kanban board, we would only talk about this section here, which is the risks and issues and blockers. So who is stuck? How are you stuck? What help do you need? I would basically go through this board and I would look for any of these sticky notes here that had a little annotation on it. And that was assigned to only talk about this one. So we didn't talk about everything in this room. We only talked about where people were stuck. So as a facilitator, we got pretty creative with things. The PMO would come in and they would create the risk registry based on what was going on in the room. And we did a whole bunch of, if I can find the other picture here quickly. Oh, here it is. This is an example of what one of the risks looked like. So as a facilitator, I would start up and I would say, okay, issue 165 is still not resolved. On August 27th, we were waiting on vendor selection. what's going on with that? And because Christine and Bev had their name on it. Okay, Christine, what's going on with the decision and vendor selection? So using that insights options experiments is what made this process evolve over time, and it eventually became the social norm based on how we facilitated it. I think the cool thing is that it showed that we were there to support and help. The reason why we actually added this audit trail was funny because, you know, you get into, okay, we're talking about issue 165, no change. All right, next one, 179, same. So then we created an audit trail, and then the PMO would take whatever they needed to put in their official risk registries and stuff. But for us as facilitators, because there was so much stuff to go through, this helped us get through those sessions a lot more quickly. I think that's all the, you know, if anybody has an interesting story or comment or other question, I think we're down to 12. So feel free to unmute, or I would say we're wrapped up. But again, I cleared my slate this afternoon. If anybody wants to just stick around and chat a little bit more.
Hey everyone, this is Ann Sutton. I'm the one that put the comment out there about technology of participation facilitation. It's actually a technique that was developed by the International Cultural Affairs Association, and I'm not selling it. I'm trained in it, but I don't sell it or anything. But they use a material that you spray with I use 3M movable adhesive. And then you don't need to rely on these teeny little sticky notes. You can actually slap full pieces of paper or half sheets or whatever you want on the wall to make it easier for people to see it and read it.
Oh,
It's a super cool tool if you're looking for another way to make your sticky walls maybe more visible and usable.
Ah, cool. They're like, have you heard of slickies? I think they're called.
I have not.
I think they're called slickies. It sounds similar. They're like static in all different shapes and sizes, but they're static. So you can just stick them on the wall and then just take them off, roll them up, and they're dry erase.
Oh, cool.
As well. I think they're called slickies too, but that's cool. I'm gonna check that out.
Yeah, I don't know where they, I went through an organization here in Minneapolis called HueLife, HueLife. And I'm assuming they just resell them from someone else. They're one of the authorized trainers of that technique.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very cool.
This is great content, though. I'm glad I joined. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. You're welcome. Anybody else interesting comment or story to share? All right, so I'll end us here. It was definitely a weird webinar. I've never done one of these overtime ones before, but oh well, it seemed like the right thing to do. So yeah, the recording will be up, and then the slides, again, if you want pictures, references, or any of the other things, go to slideshare.net/agilecoach, and you can grab them there. And I think that's about it. So thanks very much for taking the time to chat today.